Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so today I'm going to be answering a question which I've been asked dozens of times by dozens of different people. Ross, what is your very favourite Pokemon deck ever? The answer is Donphan Prime. I played it to a top 16 finish at the UK National Championships in 2011, and it's just my favourite deck ever. I absolutely adore it, so sit back, ladies and gentlemen, and let me take you through why it was so gosh darn good. It all revolved around Donphan Prime. Donphan Prime was a Stage 1 Pokemon that did 60 for a single energy. Now, we have a Pokemon that can do that nowadays. It's the Dugtrio from X and Y, reprinted in Generations. It's the same attack. The thing is, the numbers for Donphan back in the day worked so beautifully. Now, you did have to do 10 damage to each of your bench Pokemon, but if you got going fast enough, it really was a small price to pay. Free energy gave you 90 damage, although it seems like a lot, we had a couple of tricks we could work on. But I do want to stop just for a second and show you the other big cards. I mean, really, it was SP at the time. That was what was so huge. Although first, I really need to tell you about a couple of other cards in my deck. Expert Bout was absolutely brilliant, and the vast majority of the time, my Donphan would have an Expert Bout. It meant you did an extra 20 damage, got an extra 20 HP, and you gave up an extra prize, but, you know, you tanked a little bit. I suppose the other thing to mention about Donphan here, 120 HP at the time, as we're going to see, was very, very high, and an ability that reduced damage done by 20, that meant you had a bit of tankability. Time you put that up to 140 while reducing damage by 20, good times. So we see something like a Dialga G, that was one of the worst ones. 100 HP, but that's okay, because we can either use the second attack here, Heavy Impact, while using a Crobat, or we could just 2-hit KO with Earthquake. But if we look at things like Garchomp C, 80 HP, so with an Expert Bout, easy one-hit KO. Then it level X's and goes up to 110, but again, Expert Bout and Heavy Impact, you get a one-hit KO. Luxray GL had 80 HP but a weakness. Luxray GL level X had 110 HP, but it had a weakness, and it really was being played in a whole bunch of decks, not just SP decks at the time. Uxie was everywhere and had 70 HP, which made it very easy to KO. And even things like Gengar from Stormfront. Now, Fainting Spell was horrific, but again, Heavy Impact with an Expert Bout, and you would get a one-hit KO on that. The one thing people really used to play to try and stop me here was Crobat G. You see, Crobat G had 80 HP, which meant with an Expert Bout you should be able to get a KO, but it had a resistance to fighting. So one of my very favourite cards I played in this deck, Ruins of Alph. The amount of players that used to think they could try and buy a turn or two by popping up a Crobat G, Ruins of Alph got me a KO every time, and it was wonderful. So yeah, you had to use an Expert Bout in order to do a bit of extra damage, which kind of sucks, because you did then give up 2 prizes. But you hit the numbers very, very, very quickly here. It was awesome. You had a lot of bulk, and you hit big for 1 energy. Now, in terms of getting going, we actually had 2 options at the time. Back then, Rare Candy could actually be used to evolve into a Stage 1 or a Stage 2, and it could be used from the first turn of the game. Well, not the very first turn. The rules here were, if you went first, you weren't able to use trainer cards, though you could attack. So you couldn't use it going first, but other than that, you were fine. But I didn't choose to play Rare Candy in this deck, because we had Broken Time Space. Broken Time Space was an absolutely broken, pun intended, stadium which let both players evolve whenever they felt like it. I would get the turn 1 Donphan in almost every game. And I'll show you some of the ridiculous trainer cards we used in a moment. So we're basically doing 80 damage turn 1 the vast majority of the games, and we're hitting key numbers. But what other Pokemon were we using, and why were we using them? Well, first of all, we were using Uxie. Uxie was just the best draw card ever. I mean, think of it like Shaymin, except it's a non-EX, only gives up 1 prize, has a really useful attack, and draws you an extra card. It was over the top good. We also had Uxie level X. Now, downside, you couldn't level X until you went into the active, so you had to get Uxie in the active and then retreat it. Good news, you had trade-off. Every turn, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one in your hand and the other one on the bottom of your deck. Now, Zenblade was a decent attack against Pokemon that were weak to Psychic, but really here, it was all about getting in the active, level X into use trade-off and retreat. Friend of mine lent me her Uxie level X. I borrowed it until it rotated out of the format. I should also mention with Uxie that Psychic Restore puts Uxie back into your deck, so it meant you wouldn't still be in the active for Gengar's fainting spell and could get around it. We played 4 Unknown R because it was just extra draw power. It did exactly the same thing as the Unknown from Ancient Origins that newer players will be familiar with, and it was just a great amount of extra draw power. We played Crobat. It was a free retreater, which was nice, so if you started with it, you could retreat it into a Donphan, but really here it was just the extra 10 damage with Flash Bite, which you could reuse using the card Seeker, and I frequently did. And the last 2 cards I played were Regis. Regice was absolutely amazing. The ability discarded 2 cards from your hand and moved your opponent's active Pokemon. It was basically a repel, but you got to discard 2 cards from your hand. Now, firstly, this was good because Spiritomb was big at the time. So Spiritomb blocked item cards, which really sucked, so you would just get your Regice with something like a Pokemon Collector, move their Spiritomb, and then you had your trainers back. And as you'll see, trainers were a huge part of this deck. But it also allowed you to discard trainer cards from your hand, and Gengar was huge at the time. And Gengar's Poltergeist did 30 damage for every trainer, supporter, and stadium card in your hand. Back then, items were called trainers. Nowadays, trainer is the blanket term and we have items, etc. Back then, trainers were items and there was no blanket term. And of course, Uxie drew until you had 7 cards in your hand, so you could use Regice to discard cards from your hand and get going. The only thing it did on its own was really move stuff like Spiritomb, but then the other thing is, let's say, and this happened at the National Championships, your opponent puts up a Garchomp C with an Expert Belt, that's actually out of range of Donphan here, unless you can use a Crobat G and a Seeker, which is very difficult in one turn. So you use Regice, and then they put something from their bench into the active, and you KO that instead. Now, we also played Regirock here, which again discarded 2 cards from your hand, which helped to protect against Gengar and draw more cards with Uxie, etc. But this time it took a fighting energy from your discard pile to Regirock. But you wouldn't really attack with Regirock, you would use Lucian's assignment, and the theory here is very simple. Lucian's allows you to move all the energy from one Pokemon to another Pokemon. It wasn't like Shaymin where you could move them around at will, it was just as many as you like from one Pokemon to another. So in theory, you use Regirock to get a couple energy on Regirock, and then you move them over using Lucians, and then you've got a new Donphan rolling. And finally, Unknown Q, which was kind of like a mini Floatstone. It was a Pokemon, you attach it like a tool, it reduces your retreat cost by 1. Primarily it was there for Uxie, so that you could put Uxie in the active, level exit, and then retreat. Now, in terms of trainer cards here, we were set up for a very quick start, but there was also some kind of tricks and recovery for the mid-game. So we had 4 Pokemon Collector. Pokemon Collector, if you weren't playing back then, was utterly broken. Just get 3 basic Pokemon into your hand. You could get Uxie to draw cards, you could get Phanpy to try and evolve up, you could get your Regice, etc, etc. Over the top great, you had to play 4. 2 BB Search, 2 Pokemon Communication. BB Search, put any card into your deck and you got a Pokemon as a supporter. Pokemon Communication, put a Pokemon into the deck and you got another Pokemon. Now, I was playing 21 Pokemon here, so Pokemon Communication worked quite nicely, but really these were just to make sure we could search out things like Donphan as early as we liked. 1 Luxury Ball, you could only really play 1 because if it was in your discard you couldn't play it. I mean, theoretically you could put more than 1 in your deck, but you never would. And you could search for any Pokemon other than a level X. Given that the only level X I played was Uxie, this was an absolute no-brainer. Free copies of Seeker were very big. Seeker picked up one of your Pokemon and forced your opponent to do so. Sometimes you could force your opponent to pick up a Pokemon they didn't want to. Sometimes you could force them to pick up the only Pokemon on their bench, knock out their active and win. But you could reuse Uxie, reuse Crobat, or just pick up a damaged Donphan and then attach the Expert Belt and Energy to an active Donphan and off you go. You could just retreat a Donphan here, pick it up with Seeker, and you are off, although you couldn't pick up an active Pokemon with Seeker. For Pokédraw Plus, this was one of the things that really helped the deck to work. If you played one, you drew a card, nobody cared. If you played two, you searched for two cards. Think of it like something like a Twins or a Teammates, except there's nothing that you're relying on here, no being behind on prizes or having a Pokemon knocked out. You got two in your hand, you searched your deck for any two cards, and there were enough draw cards in this deck that you did that quite a lot. I mean, between Unknown R and Uxie and all of that, you really could get the Pokédraw Plus rolling. Now, the next two cards are kind of weird, because looking back, it's hard to imagine that we only played these as one-offs. Junk Arm, an amazing card where you discard two cards from your hand, and then grab a trainer card from your discard pile. Think of it like a slightly underpowered dowsing machine. You could play four in your deck, but I only chose to play one, because I just didn't need more than one. And a single copy of Versus Seeker. Newer players may find it weird that we only played one Versus Seeker, but the reality is that back in a format where we've got Uxie and Uxie Level X and Pokédraw Plus, we just didn't need multiple Versus Seeker here. Free Expert Belt, like I've said, you just need to play Expert Belt here. In a deck like Donphan, the extra damage and bulk is worth giving up an extra prize. That's the way it is. Free copies of Switch because you've got a high retreat cost. One copy of Lost Remover. Lost Remover was Enhanced Hammer, but it put the energy to the Lost Zone. Honestly, this never really worked out for me. The theory was that lots of decks were playing double colorless energy and Dialga decks were playing special metal and all of that. Honestly, it was one of those things where you really had to play four of them to get the real benefit of it. And I only played one. Sorry about that. Lucians we've talked about, Broken Time Space we've talked about, and Ruins of Alph we have talked about. Here is the list that I used to Top Cut Nationals in its entirety. I'd probably drop the Lost Remover, and I would put in, honestly, it would just be another consistency card, maybe another Uxie, maybe another Pokemon Communication, but honestly, it was a really, really good deck. In terms of matchups, it really was very simple. SP decks, you should smash. Decks that had a really heavy Dialga line, you would generally lose to, but most people played Dialga as like a 1-1, and that just wasn't enough. You hit the numbers, you had the speed, you smashed SP decks. Gengar should have been a very bad matchup, given that they played it with Vileplume, but honestly here, between Regice to move the active and the fact that you were one-hit KOing, this really came down to Fainting Spell flips. If they hit 50% or fewer on Fainting Spells, you won. If they hit over 50%, you lost. You should beat this, but it really came down to coin flips. And then there was Gyarados. You just didn't beat Gyarados. Gyarados was hitting you for weakness, had 130 HP, which is pretty much out of your range, and it had the resistance. It just smashed you. You got smashed by Gyarados. You had no Gyarados matchup. But Gyarados wasn't played much in the UK, and actually the only one I played at Nationals, I managed to donk them, which was kind of upsetting for them, but kind of good for me. You smashed SP, and you had probably a 60-40 Vilegar matchup. Back then, that put you on the top tables of tournaments. Unfortunately, by the time I perfected the list, I took it to 3 Battle Roads, taking 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, weirdly, and I took it to Nationals, getting a top 16, losing in fairly heartbreaking fashion to a Vilegar that just, I think they hit 5 out of 5 on Fainting Spell flips in the match. Bearing in mind, right, you've got an Expert Belt on, so you KO Gengar to take 1 prize, and then they flip a heads to take 2 prizes. That was what was so annoying about Gengar. I've gone into a little bit of detail here, but I really wanted to explain this. This was literally my favourite Pokemon deck ever. I don't think I've ever made a better deck myself. I don't think I've ever had more fun playing a deck, and I honestly wish I'd been able to get to Worlds that year, because this really was a deck which took down the metagame. Other than Gyarados, you got smashed by Gyarados. I will pop a link in the description to an article I wrote for 6 Prizes where I explain all my matchups at Nationals, so if you want to read about my matches, you can do so. But I think I've explained the deck very well here. Now it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen. In the comment section, I want to know, what is your favourite Pokemon deck ever? Let me know, ladies and gentlemen. Also, if you played Donphan or played against it, share your memories, lists, etc. in the comment section. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWossy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGradio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts, etc., head on over to patreon.com/PTCGradio. And do check out my video game channel, Wossy Plays, for some more Wossy action. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.